At the height of the Second World War, when nearly every aircraft in the Pacific was designed to strike fast or die trying, America deployed something completely different, an enormous, slow-moving flying boat that carried radar, bombs, depth charges, and yes, even its own kitchen. In an era defined by speed, firepower, and the brutal calculus of aerial combat, the consolidated PBY Catalina stood apart as a machine that defied every expectation of what a wartime aircraft should be, because instead of diving into dogfights or racing through bombing runs, it drifted across oceans at the pace of a modern highway car, gliding low and steady above waves that hid entire fleets beneath them. And yet this unlikely giant became one of the most decisive tools of American power in the Pacific, a long-range sentry whose real weapon was its endurance, its patience, and the crews who lived inside it for 20 hours at a time, heating coffee on a tiny galley stove as they searched millions of square miles of open sea for a single moment that might change the war. At 5:30 on June 4, 1942, as the first pale light of dawn cracked across the horizon of Midway Atoll, a 24-year-old lieutenant named Howard Addy guided his PBY-5 Catalina across the calm black water of the lagoon, the hull hissing as it gathered speed, the engines rumbling like two distant storms, and the aircraft lifting into the dim sky on a patrol that Navy intelligence hoped, almost desperately, would answer the one question keeping the entire Pacific Fleet awake. Where exactly was the Japanese strike force moving, and when would it hit? The Catalina was not designed for heroics, not built for combat, and certainly not admired for its looks or speed, but rather for its ability to remain airborne for an entire day, scanning endless ocean in long, monotonous arcs, and this endurance made it the only aircraft capable of performing the search pattern Addy was assigned that morning, a 700-mile triangle carved through empty sea, where the enemy could hide with ease beneath millions of shimmering blue waves. Addy's Catalina, tail number 23P6, flew low and unhurried, the crew already settling into the ritual that had defined their last 4 months on Midway, because Catalina patrols were endurance tests of discipline more than skill, with pilots rotating every few hours, gunners scanning the horizon through blister windows, and the navigator working slide rules and plotting boards to keep the aircraft on its razor-thin search grid, while behind them the humble galley, the tiny metal counter with a hot plate bolted into it, waited for the moment when someone would heat the first tin of coffee, the unofficial fuel that kept Catalina crews functioning through the long, slow crawl of their missions. But this morning was different. Radio intercepts had whispered of something huge approaching. The Marines on Midway had been sleeping in foxholes for days, and every available aircraft, from the lumbering B-17Cs to the Marine fighters parked wingtip to wingtip, stood ready for a strike they all felt was imminent. And so when Addy reached the outer edge of his patrol sector and saw, at 5:30, thin black pillars of smoke rising from the curvature of the earth like signals painted across the sky, he turned his flying boat toward them with the calm inevitability of a man who suddenly understood that the fate of the entire Pacific campaign might lie inside the next few minutes of his life. As the Catalina descended to 1,000 feet, the ocean below came alive with shapes, first dark specks, then silhouettes, then unmistakable outlines of 2 Japanese aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, the entire striking arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy moving at high speed toward Midway, exactly what intelligence hoped would appear somewhere within this vast, almost impossible-to-search expanse. Without hesitation, Addy's radioman tapped out the message that would ignite the Battle of Midway: 2 carriers and main body, bearing 320. Distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25 knots. That transmission, sent at 5:34, reached every American commander in the Pacific within minutes, giving them the one thing the PBY existed to deliver: information precise and timely delivered from an aircraft that had no business surviving long enough to see it. The Catalina, slow and vulnerable, should have been an easy kill for the Zero fighters scrambling from the Japanese carriers below, but Addy climbed into cloud cover at 4,000 feet and began a 3-hour duel against a superior enemy armed with nothing but weather, patience, and the deliberate, methodical flying style taught to every PBY pilot. He darted through clouds, dipped beneath them, re-emerged miles away, took fresh bearings on the enemy fleet, transmitted updates, and vanished again before the Zeros could pinpoint his position, turning the sky itself into a shield while maintaining continuous contact on a fleet whose movements would determine the entire battle plan of the US Pacific Fleet. By the time he was relieved at 8:30, Adi had done more than find the Japanese carriers. He had tracked them long enough to give American dive bombers the perfect window to strike, and although he would never describe himself as anything more than a man doing his job, his quiet persistence inside that slow, cumbersome flying boat set into motion the chain of events that would turn Midway from a desperate gamble into one of the most decisive victories in American naval history. To understand why the PBY Catalina became indispensable across the Pacific, one must first understand what it was not. Because in a war dominated by fast carrier fighters, high-altitude bombers, and sweeping naval armadas, this aircraft was neither fast nor glamorous nor remotely intimidating. Instead, it was a machine designed around a single uncompromising idea that in a theater as unimaginably vast as the Pacific Ocean, the ability to stay airborne for 20 hours and search areas larger than entire countries mattered far more than speed or firepower. And so the Catalina emerged not as a predator but as a sentry, a guardian of the empty blue void where fleets could disappear without leaving a trace. Built in 1935 by Consolidated Aircraft, the Catalina fused simplicity with purpose. A parasol-mounted wing high above the fuselage that maximized lift, a hull shaped like a boat to land almost anywhere water existed, and two Pratt & Whitney radial engines that were rugged, fuel-efficient, and powerful enough to keep the aircraft aloft at a modest 115 miles per hour, a speed barely competitive even by pre-war standards, yet perfectly calibrated to conserve fuel during marathon missions. The aircraft's interior felt less like a fighting machine and more like the cramped interior of a small maritime outpost. Narrow walkways between fuel tanks, blister turrets where gunners crouched for hours scanning the horizon, and behind the flight deck a tiny living space containing two bunks, a chemical toilet, and the Catalina's most surprising amenity, a galley, consisting of a hot plate, a water boiler, and enough space for a stack of canned food that became the lifeline of crews enduring missions that stretched from dusk into the following day. Veterans often joked that the Catalina was a flying fuel tank with wings, because every inch of unused space held fuel. Fuel inside the hull, fuel inside the wings, fuel inside auxiliary tanks that could be bolted on when extended patrols were required, and while this allowed flights of over 2,500 miles, it also meant the aircraft was slow to climb, heavy to maneuver, and vulnerable if hit. A single cannon round in the wrong place could turn the aircraft into a fireball, and crews lived with this knowledge every time they rose into the sky. Yet for all its vulnerabilities, the Catalina succeeded because it could perform the kind of slow, methodical search work that faster aircraft simply couldn't, flying low over the ocean where its crew could study shadows, wake patterns, metallic glints, and oil slicks, tiny details invisible from fast bombers or high-altitude reconnaissance planes, details that often meant distinguishing between a wave crest and a surfaced submarine. For the men who served aboard it, the Catalina was both a workplace and a temporary home, a metal cocoon, where long hours of monotony were broken only by the hiss of hot water boiling for coffee, the rattling of canned sausages passed down the fuselage, or occasional bursts of adrenaline when a contact appeared or a radio message crackled through the static. They learned to sleep in snatches between engine vibrations, to live with the smell of oil and gasoline, to ignore the cold of high-altitude patrols, or the suffocating heat of tropical flights, where the greenhouse canopy turned the cockpit into an oven, and they developed a camaraderie rooted in shared endurance, because Catalina crews did not simply fly missions, they survived them. The Navy quickly realized the aircraft's versatility exceeded even its designer's hopes. It could patrol, bomb, scout, rescue, escort convoys, lay mines, spot submarines, and operate from any lagoon or sheltered bay, turning remote atolls into forward reconnaissance posts almost overnight. Islands with no airstrips, no infrastructure, no military value suddenly became critical nodes in the patrol network because if the Catalina could be refueled from barges or drums rolled down the beach, it could fly from anywhere, and this gave the U.S. Navy eyes in regions where no other aircraft could reach. By 1943, the Catalina was everywhere: Alaska, the Solomons, the Aleutians, the Coral Sea, the Indian Ocean, Australia's northern coast, and even the frigid North Atlantic, where crews patrolled for U-boats in conditions so harsh that frostbite and hypothermia were as dangerous as enemy fire. Its contribution to the war, however, expanded far beyond reconnaissance, because once commanders recognized the aircraft's extreme range and night-flying capability, they began assigning it roles no one had initially envisioned, roles that would transform the Catalina from an unglamorous patrol craft into one of the most creatively employed aircraft in the entire Pacific campaign. The transformation of the Catalina from a daytime patrol aircraft into one of the most feared nocturnal hunters in the Pacific began almost accidentally, born not from strategic planning but from battlefield necessity, because by late 1942 the Japanese Navy dominated the daylight hours around the Solomon Islands, their Zero fighters swarming over sea lanes and their destroyers racing through the night on high-speed resupply runs that the Americans called the Tokyo Express, a relentless conveyor belt of troops, ammunition, and supplies that kept Japan's foothold in the region alive despite the brutal fighting on Guadalcanal. Traditional American aircraft struggled to interdict these nighttime operations. Bombers could not see targets clearly, fighters lacked the range to loiter after dusk, and destroyers risked ambush by superior Japanese night tactics, leaving the US desperate for a platform that could strike silently, unexpectedly, and at long range. It was Lieutenant Commander Clarence Taff who recognized that the PBY Catalina, slow and unbeautiful as it was, might be the perfect night predator, because its enormous wings and stable handling made low-altitude flight at night surprisingly manageable, and its capacity to remain airborne for entire evenings allowed it to stalk enemy convoys without revealing its presence. But the Catalina, in its standard configuration painted grey and white, marked with bright insignia, and loaded for daytime patrol, was useless in darkness, so Taff initiated a series of modifications that would reshape the aircraft's identity. The first step was paint. Every inch of the fuselage, wing, blister turrets, and even the national markings were covered in matte black, transforming the aircraft into a silhouette that disappeared completely above moonlit water. Crews reduced reflective surfaces taped over metal edges, and even darkened cockpit instruments to prevent stray light from leaking through the canopy, creating an aircraft so visually elusive that Japanese lookouts sometimes reported hearing engine noise without ever spotting the plane itself. Next came tactics. Daytime PBY crews flew precise search patterns, straight lines, predictable headings, consistent altitude, but at night Taft taught his squadron to fly like predators, hugging island shorelines to mask their approach, skimming the ocean at 50 feet to avoid detection, then climbing just long enough to identify a target before diving again into darkness. They replaced depth charges with bombs, occasionally torpedoes, and used their side blisters as improvised attack platforms, dropping flares, grenades, and anything else that might damage an enemy vessel. One crew famously attacked a submarine using Molotov cocktails made from beer bottles filled with aviation fuel, an absurd image born from improvisation that nevertheless captured the anarchic creativity of the Black Cats. As the Black Cat squadrons expanded across the Solomons, New Guinea, the Aleutians, and eventually the Philippines, their legend grew among both American and Japanese forces. The Americans admired them for their results. Merchant ships destroyed, convoys disrupted, supply lines fractured, coastal barges burned, and night operations increasingly dangerous for the Japanese, who had once considered the darkness their greatest advantage. But to Japanese sailors, the Black Cats became a kind of nocturnal terror, ghostly shapes emerging from the clouds, their engines throbbing low over the water, sometimes invisible until their bombs splashed down, and then gone again before anti-aircraft guns could fire. The sound of a Catalina's twin radial engines in the darkness took on a psychological weight, a presence that forced ships to maintain blackout conditions, post extra lookouts, and alter routes simply to avoid the possibility of a night attack. Yet the success of these missions came with enormous risk. Flying at night at 50 feet above the ocean in a large, lumbering aircraft meant that a single navigation error, a sudden downdraft, or a misjudged wave height could destroy the aircraft instantly, and many Black Cats were lost not to enemy action but to the unstable marriage of darkness and low-altitude flying. Crews flew in pitch-black conditions without radar, using only the faint outline of islands or phosphorescent surf to orient themselves. They learned to trust their instincts, to feel the aircraft's position through engine vibration and the pressure in their ears, and to work together with a level of cohesion that bordered on telepathy. Squadrons that deployed with 7 aircraft sometimes returned with only 3, and those that survived night after night of attacks spoke of the mental exhaustion that came with constant tension, the knowledge that a single mistake meant vanishing into the ocean without a trace. Despite these dangers, the Black Cats fundamentally changed the dynamics of the Pacific Night War. They became the eyes, ears, and claws of the Allies in darkness, performing reconnaissance, bombing, mine-laying, submarine hunting, and harassment missions that stretched from dusk until sunrise. They closed the Tokyo Express routes, disrupted reinforcement schedules, and forced Japanese commanders to divert destroyers, barges, and escorts simply to defend against them. The Catalina, once dismissed as a plodding reconnaissance craft, now occupied the psychological space of a silent predator whose arrival could not be predicted, whose attack could not be anticipated, and whose disappearance into the black horizon left Japanese crews wondering when the next strike would come. But the Catalina's most enduring legacy would come not from the ships it destroyed, nor the convoys it disrupted, but from the lives it saved, because even as Black Cats stalked the night, other PBY crews became the beating heart of the Navy's most compassionate mission, rescuing those who fell into the ocean's unforgiving grasp. If the Black Cats represented the Catalina's transformation into a silent hunter of the night, then its role as a rescue aircraft revealed the aircraft's deeper and far more human legacy, because in the vastness of the Pacific, where thousands of pilots and aircrewmen vanished into the ocean after their aircraft were shot down, damaged, or forced to ditch, the Catalina became the one machine that could reach them, land beside them, and lift them out of waters that would otherwise become their graves. As the war intensified in 1943 and Allied air operations expanded across the Pacific, losses increased accordingly. Fighters went down in dogfights, bombers ditched after mechanical failures, and entire crews found themselves drifting in life rafts surrounded by sharks, dehydration, burning fuel slicks, or the crushing loneliness of open ocean. And in those moments there was only one phrase that offered hope: a Dumbo is coming. Dumbo, named after the Disney elephant capable of improbable feats, became the call sign for Catalina rescue missions, and from the moment they were institutionalized, the aircraft performed what many aviators considered miracles, landing in conditions that no other aircraft would dare attempt. The PBY's boat-like hull and strong keel allowed it to survive landings in swells measuring 8, 9, sometimes even 10 feet, conditions that could easily rip apart lesser aircraft, and it was this capability that made the Catalina the natural centerpiece of the Navy's rescue network, a network that pilots depended upon with an almost religious faith. Because a pilot who knew rescue was possible fought more aggressively, pressed his attack further, and took risks that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war, and commanders recognized that the morale benefit of reliable rescue was not just humanitarian but strategically decisive. One of the most dramatic rescues occurred on April 18, 1943, when Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's most famous ace from World War I, crash-landed in the Pacific during an inspection tour. Rickenbacker and 7 others drifted for 24 excruciating days, enduring starvation, storms, and exposure, their ordeal becoming a national story. It was a PBY, flown by Lieutenant William Eady of VP-51, that finally spotted the ragged survivors and attempted the kind of landing most pilots feared to even consider, dropping the flying boat into rough seas, rolling violently as the hull struck wave after wave, but remaining intact long enough for the crew to haul the survivors aboard. The Catalina was battered, taking on water, and dangerously overloaded, yet it rose back into the air, carrying Rickenbacker to safety, a moment that cemented the aircraft's reputation not only as a technological marvel, but as a symbol of hope for anyone lost at sea. But the greatest rescue pilot of the Catalina War was Lieutenant Nathan Gordon of VP-34, whose Medal of Honor mission on February 15, 1944, remains one of the most astonishing feats in aerial rescue history. After Japanese fighters mauled multiple American aircraft near Cavien, Gordon answered the distress calls and descended into a harbor still under heavy enemy fire. He landed once, took survivors aboard, took off again under strafing, circled back, landed a second time under even heavier fire, then a third time, this time touching down so close to a burning aircraft that flaming debris nearly engulfed the Catalina. Each landing placed the PBY at the threshold of destruction. Each takeoff required navigating through gunfire and fuel slicks. Each retrieval added weight that made the aircraft slower, more vulnerable, and more likely to capsize on takeoff. But Gordon would not leave men behind, and by the time he completed his third extraction he had rescued 15 airmen, many of whom would have died within minutes if he had hesitated. His actions captured the essence of the Catalina's rescue role, courage made possible by a machine uniquely capable of surviving the ocean's fury. While these high-profile rescues made headlines, thousands of others occurred quietly, without fanfare, in empty stretches of ocean where no one else was watching. A Catalina might spend hours circling a life raft before landing. It might taxi miles across open sea, sometimes for over an hour, burning precious fuel, just to reach a drifting pilot. It might wait motionless in swells, the crew throwing ropes and flotation gear to freezing, oil-soaked men. And once survivors were aboard, the aircraft would often have to taxi for miles again, because the waves were too high for takeoff, until a patch of calmer water could be found. Crews described these rescues as the most exhausting flights of their careers, because even after saving the survivors, they still had to coax their overloaded aircraft back into the air, riding each swell like a surfboard, until the wings finally caught enough lift to break free of the water. The Catalina even pioneered long-range medical evacuations, its interior modified in some squadrons to carry stretchers and medical attendants. In remote island chains where field hospitals were non-existent and airstrips unusable, the PBY served as a flying ambulance, landing in secluded bays, river mouths, and lagoons to extract critically wounded soldiers or downed airmen. One extraordinary evacuation occurred in the Solomon Islands, when a PBY landed in a narrow river mouth to retrieve a severely wounded Marine. The pilot navigated between jungle-covered banks so tight that the wingtips nearly brushed the trees, landed in a space barely wider than the hull, loaded the casualty, and then managed to take off down a twisting channel with no margin for error. That Marine survived because the Catalina turned impossible terrain into a rescue zone. By 1944, these operations evolved into a coordinated system in which PBYs orbited offshore during major air raids, waiting for distress calls the moment aircraft went down. Fighters and bombers launched missions knowing that the Dumbos were already in position to retrieve them. The result was a profound shift in pilot psychology, the fear of being lost at sea, a dread that had haunted aviators since the earliest days of flight, was tempered by the knowledge that somewhere out there hidden in the haze was a slow, dependable flying boat, whose crew would risk everything to bring them home. It is no exaggeration to say that the Catalina saved more lives than any other aircraft of World War II, and its rescue legacy was so deeply ingrained into the identity of the US Navy that even decades later veterans spoke of the PBY with a reverence reserved not for machines but for guardians, metal angels with boat hulls, engines that never quit, and crews who refused to let their fellow airmen vanish beneath the waves. Even as the Catalina carved out its reputation as the ultimate rescue platform, the aircraft continued to expand into roles far beyond its original design, evolving into a multi-purpose tool whose adaptability gave the Allied war effort a depth and flexibility that few commanders could have anticipated in 1935. This versatility stemmed from the PBY's unique amphibious nature, its ability to operate from water, from short runways, from rough lagoons, from coral atolls, and from bases so remote and primitive that other aircraft would have stood no chance of survival. And because of this, the Navy discovered that the Catalina could fill operational gaps across the Pacific in a way no other single aircraft could. One of the most strategic uses of the Catalina came in long-range intelligence-gathering missions, particularly once radar-equipped variants entered service. Early in the war, reconnaissance depended entirely on visual sightings, which meant that weather, nightfall, and distance could easily render entire fleets invisible. But by 1943, modified PBYs carried ASV air-to-surface vessel radar sets that transformed their capabilities, allowing them to detect ships and submarines hidden in fog, darkness, or storms, conditions that defined the Aleutian Islands campaign. Squadrons like VP-63 operated out of frigid bases in Alaska where fog often forced ships to navigate blind, and it was the Catalina's radar, sweeping silently across the grey nothingness, that guided entire naval task forces to their targets. During the battle to retake Attu Island in May 1943, PBY radar operators provided navigation cues so precise that destroyers and transports moved through fog as thick as concrete, relying entirely on Catalina guidance to avoid collisions and maintain formation. Without these radar-equipped flying boats, the entire invasion could have dissolved into chaos before a single Marine stepped ashore. Beyond intelligence work, the Catalina also became a mine layer, slipping into enemy harbors at night to deploy naval mines in channels too shallow or narrow for larger bombers. In the Philippines and along the New Guinea coast, Black Cat PB-4Y squadrons routinely flew low-level approaches into bays guarded by anti-aircraft guns, releasing mines that forced Japanese supply ships to alter their routes or risk sudden destruction. These missions were among the most dangerous of the war. Slow, steady aircraft navigating predictable patterns over enemy-controlled waterways, but the PBY crews understood the strategic impact a single well-placed mine could choke a supply line more effectively than a dozen bombing raids. At the same time, the Catalina served as a communications lifeline for one of the Pacific War's most courageous resistance elements, the Coast Watchers. Stationed across remote islands, these Allied operatives monitored Japanese movements and relayed intelligence back to headquarters, often at enormous personal risk, but they could remain effective only if supplied and occasionally extracted, and it was the PBY able to land on lagoons, river mouths, and hidden coves that kept them alive. Nowhere was this role more pronounced than in the Royal Australian Air Force, whose pilots became legendary for their milk run flights, dangerous journeys into enemy-controlled waters to deliver messages, batteries, radios, medicine, and food to isolated coast watchers, then evacuating wounded or compromised operatives under the nose of Japanese patrols. Flight Lieutenant G.H. Hemsworth flew 112 such missions, more than any other pilot, surviving 3 shoot-downs and countless close calls. These operations rarely made headlines, but they preserved one of the Allies' most valuable intelligence networks throughout the war. The Catalina's versatility extended even into civilian aviation. With newer, faster aircraft diverted to military service, Pan American Airways turned to PBYs to maintain transoceanic mail routes and essential passenger service between Pacific territories. These flights, often stretching 18 hours or more, demanded the same endurance and quiet professionalism as military missions. Though cramped and uncomfortable, the Catalina allowed communications and transport to continue during the darkest moments of the war, and for those who flew aboard them, diplomats, scientists, engineers, and strategic couriers, the slow hum of the radial engines became a symbol of connection across a world fractured by conflict. By late 1944, as the Allies progressed across the Pacific, the Catalina's role expanded once more into medical evacuation. The aircraft's range, water landing capability, and interior space made it ideal for retrieving wounded soldiers from isolated beaches or island strongholds. Modified PB-2B and PBY-5 variants carried stretchers along the fuselage, with Navy corpsmen administering treatment during long flights back to island hospitals or hospital ships. Catalina medevac missions lacked the drama of fighter combat or the spectacle of bombing raids, but they saved lives in ways that statistics alone could never convey. Each evac flight meant that a wounded Marine who would otherwise have died alone in a jungle clearing instead received timely care because a single flying boat could slip through terrain inaccessible to any other aircraft. In every theater, from the Aleutians to the Solomons, from Ceylon to the Indian Ocean, from Australia to the Persian Gulf, the Catalina demonstrated an almost unnatural ability to adapt. It hunted submarines in the Atlantic, stalked cargo ships across the Java Sea, delivered supplies to the Burmese front, patrolled for U-boats off Newfoundland, and even escorted convoys across icy northern waters where storms could swallow ships whole. The fact that a single airframe could perform reconnaissance, bombing, transport, mining, rescue, and medical evacuation without losing its core identity makes the PBY Catalina one of the most versatile military aircraft ever built. A machine defined not by its limitations but by what its crews learned to do despite them. As the war approached its final year, the Catalina remained as relevant as on the day Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. It had become a Swiss Army knife of the sky, never the sharpest blade, never the most glamorous, but always reliable, always present, always ready to take on the missions no other aircraft could or would. As the Pacific War reached its crescendo and American industry flooded the skies with newer, faster aircraft, The PBY Catalina remained entrenched not only within the US Navy, but across the entire Allied world, becoming a quiet yet indispensable backbone for nations whose survival depended on their ability to see over the horizon. What made the Catalina unique among wartime aircraft was not merely its endurance or its amphibious capability, but the fact that it could be built, modified, or borrowed in enormous numbers, and immediately put to work in roles that stretched from anti-submarine patrols over the cold grey Atlantic to weather reconnaissance in the Indian Ocean, from Arctic convoy escort to clandestine operations behind enemy lines. The Royal Air Force embraced the Catalina early, recognizing that Britain, an island nation fighting a naval war for its life, needed long-range patrol aircraft capable of escorting convoys across the vast, deadly space where German U-boats hunted merchant ships. Over 600 Catalinas served in the RAF Coastal Command, flying missions that were often more grueling than their Pacific counterparts, because the North Atlantic was not merely vast but hostile, with freezing storms, gale-force winds, and low visibility that turned every patrol into a battle against nature as much as against the enemy. It was a Catalina of number 209 Squadron RAF that first spotted the German battleship Bismarck in May 1941, reporting her position and enabling the Royal Navy to intercept and sink the most feared warship in the Atlantic. That single sighting demonstrated the aircraft's strategic value on a global scale. It did not need to shoot down enemy aircraft or sink warships to change the fate of an entire theater, it simply needed to see. The Royal Canadian Air Force employed Catalinas designated CANSO in Canadian service on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, patrolling for U-boats near Newfoundland, escorting convoys along the St. Lawrence River, and conducting search and rescue operations in frigid waters where survival times were measured in minutes. Canadian crews developed innovations of their own, including improved anti-icing procedures and survival kits tailored for Arctic conditions, transforming the Catalina into a machine capable of enduring some of the harshest flying environments on Earth. In the vast northern expanses where airfields were sparse and weather changed with lethal suddenness, the Catalina's ability to land on lakes, bays, and sheltered coves meant the difference between life and death for downed airmen or stranded sailors. Even the Soviet Union, through the Lend-Lease program, received 189 Catalinas, deploying them in the Arctic, the Baltic, and the Far East. Soviet naval aviators flew them on long-range patrols over icy seas where German submarines operated beneath the polar night, and later in the Pacific as the USSR prepared for its brief but intense campaign against Japan in 1945. The Catalina's durability earned the respect of Soviet crews who operated in conditions that tested both machinery and human endurance, temperatures plunging below freezing, magnetic anomalies affecting compasses, and remote bases where maintenance meant improvisation rather than engineering support. The Royal Australian Air Force, perhaps more than any other non-American force, made the Catalina its signature aircraft, adapting it to missions that ranged from reconnaissance to psychological operations. Australian Catalinas laid mines in harbours along the coasts of Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, often flying missions lasting 20 hours or more, making them some of the longest-duration combat flights of the entire war. They conducted leaflet drops over Japanese-occupied territories, warning civilians of impending operations or encouraging resistance. They inserted and extracted coast watchers, delivered supplies to Allied guerrillas in remote jungles, and evacuated civilians trapped behind enemy lines. No other aircraft in the Australian arsenal could match the reach and flexibility of the PBY, and for the thousands of men and women whose survival depended on those missions, the sight of a Catalina landing in a moonlit bay was nothing short of salvation. The aircraft even extended its reach into the commercial world during wartime, as Pan American Airways and other civilian carriers used Catalinas to maintain transoceanic routes when faster-flying boats were requisitioned for military use. These flights supported diplomatic transport, mail service, and critical personnel movement across the Pacific and Atlantic, linking continents at a time when global communication was frayed by conflict. Passengers aboard these flights often spoke of the strange, meditative quiet of the Catalina's long ocean crossings, the rhythmic hum of radial engines replacing the chaos of war with a fragile thread of continuity between distant shores. Despite its age and the rapid evolution of aircraft technology during the war, the Catalina continued to roll off production lines in the United States and Canada. Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego produced the majority, but Canadian Vickers and Boeing Canada added hundreds more, ensuring that even as newer designs emerged, the Allies could rely on a steady supply of this proven workhorse. By the end of production in 1945, more than 3,000 Catalinas had been built across multiple factories, a number that reflected not just the aircraft's usefulness but its reliability, an aircraft trusted by crews who understood that in the most unforgiving corners of the Earth, dependability mattered more than glamour. When Japan finally agreed to surrender on August 14, 1945, multiple PBYs were already airborne on routine patrols, conducting the same long, patient missions they had flown since the earliest days of the war. These aircraft completed their patrols, returned to base, and logged the final operational flights of the Catalina in World War II. For many of the men aboard them, the war had begun with the sight of a burning Pearl Harbor or the desperate days of early defeat. To end it in the cockpit of the same aircraft that had carried them across every corner of the Pacific felt symbolic, as if the Catalina itself had endured the war alongside them, absorbing its hardships and bearing witness to its triumphs and tragedies. The end of the war did not end the Catalina's service. Instead, it continued to fly in dozens of countries for decades, fighting forest fires, carrying passengers to remote islands, performing search and rescue missions, and in some cases serving as the last operational flying boats in the world. Even today, a small number remain airworthy, their engines echoing across lakes and coastlines like living artifacts from another age. A reminder that the aircraft which helped win one of history's greatest conflicts was also built with a timelessness that extended far beyond the battlefield. By the time the world emerged from the ashes of 1945, the PBY Catalina had already transcended the narrow definitions of a wartime aircraft, and entered that rare category of machines whose legacy is measured not by technical specifications or combat statistics, but by the human stories attached to them, because the Catalina's true contribution lay in the sum of millions of miles flown over empty ocean, in thousands of patrols that ended with no sightings at all, in the silent endurance of crews who trusted an aircraft that never pretended to be anything other than what it was: slow, patient, rugged, dependable, and willing to go wherever the war demanded, even when those places were too far, too dark, too dangerous, or too remote for any other machine. Its pilots often said that flying a Catalina was not an act of aggression, but one of responsibility, because the aircraft carried with it the burden of vigilance, a duty to find enemy fleets before they struck, to shadow convoys through storms that would terrify even seasoned sailors, to land beside wounded or drowning men when the sea itself seemed determined to swallow them, and to perform these missions day after day without recognition, without headlines, without the glamour of dogfights or dramatic bombing raids. And yet, when history looks at decisive moments like the Battle of Midway, at the closing of the Tokyo Express, at the survival of thousands of aviators rescued from oil-slicked water, or at the knowledge that convoys reached their destinations because distant PBY crews maintained watch in all weather, it becomes clear that victory in the Pacific was built not only on aircraft carriers and battleships, but also on the slow, unglamorous work of flying boats that turned the impossible scale of the ocean into something knowable, measurable, and survivable. Even after the war ended, the Catalina refused to fade into obsolescence. Smaller nations purchased surplus PBYs and integrated them into their fledgling air forces, using them for maritime patrol, search and rescue, transport, and even anti-smuggling operations in waters far from the battlefields of the 1940s. In the hands of civilian operators, the Catalina transformed again, hauling passengers to remote islands, delivering supplies to communities reachable only by sea, and eventually becoming one of the most effective aerial firefighting platforms ever built, scooping thousands of gallons of water from lakes and rivers to battle forest fires across North America and Europe. The same hull that had once slammed into Pacific swells under enemy fire now skimmed across tranquil lakes to lift water skyward as a weapon of preservation rather than destruction, an evolution that symbolized the peaceful potential of wartime innovation. Perhaps what kept the Catalina alive so long after newer technology surpassed it was the inherent honesty of its design. The aircraft never tried to be fast, never pretended to be agile, never boasted the armor, firepower, or sleek lines of the fighters and bombers that shared the skies. Instead, it embraced the fundamental needs of maritime aviation: range, stability, endurance, and the ability to land on the world's oldest runway, the sea itself. These qualities ensured that even as jet aircraft became the standard and flying boats disappeared from modern aviation, the Catalina remained relevant wherever distance, weather, and geography demanded something more than speed. And then there were the men who flew it, crews who carried its memory long after their combat tours ended, men who described the Catalina, not with the distant technical language reserved for weapons, but with the fondness one reserves for a loyal companion. Many veterans admitted that the Catalina never inspired the adrenaline rush of a fighter cockpit or the thundering power of a heavy bomber, yet they remembered with absolute clarity the sound of its engines droning through the night, the quiet moments boiling coffee at 10,000 feet, the gentle sway of its wings during long patrols, and the sight of survivors clambering aboard over the hull, faces sunburned, exhausted, and grateful in ways words could barely capture. They remembered the stillness of moonlit water before a night landing, the shock of a violent swell slamming into the keel, the pride of returning with rescued men alive, and the somber realization that thousands of other patrols ended with nothing to report except that the ocean had been wide, empty, and endlessly patient. Lieutenant Howard Addy, the young pilot whose dawn sighting at Midway altered the course of the Pacific War, embodied this quiet humility. He retired from the Navy as a captain, lived a life outside the spotlight, and rarely spoke of that morning when his steady, deliberate flying in a slow-flying boat gave the United States the critical information it needed to win one of the most important naval battles in history. When asked later about his role, he responded with the simplicity typical of Catalina crews. He was just doing his job. It was not modesty, it was the culture of men who flew aircraft that demanded discipline rather than glory, endurance rather than speed, and precision rather than spectacle. In the end, the PBY Catalina stands as one of the defining aircraft of World War II, not because it destroyed the most enemy planes, or because it carried the largest bomb load, or because it broke records for speed, but because it solved the fundamental challenge of the Pacific War: the need to see, to find, to watch, and to rescue across distances so vast that only a flying boat with unmatched endurance could bridge them. It was a machine that embodied the principle that wars are won not only by the loudest weapons but by quiet persistence, steady eyes, and the ability to bring men home alive. And as long as a handful of Catalinas continue to fly today, engines rumbling, hulls skimming across water, wings catching the same sunlight that once reflected off Pacific swells, they remain living reminders of an era when courage and endurance took the shape of a slow, patient aircraft that came with a kitchen, a crew who trusted it with their lives, and a legacy that helped win the most far-reaching war in human history.